All right, hey everyone, let's jump right into this deep dive. We're looking at the German election today. Um, Kind of surprising outcome, right? Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty big moment for German politics, and it looks like the effects are going to be felt, well, everywhere, really, in Europe, even over here in the U.S. And to get a good handle on what's happening, we've pulled some great sources. We've got The Guardian, New York Times, of course, and get this, a couple of Italian and German publications, too.
Ah, nice.
Yeah, so we'll get a different perspective maybe.
Yeah, those can be really revealing sometimes, those less familiar perspectives.
Totally. So, what's on the table? Well, a potential power shift in Europe. We've got a far-right party gaining some serious ground. And then there's Merz, the new chancellor, and his personality. Well, let's just say he's not afraid to stir things up.
Definitely seems that way.
Okay, so to set the scene, you remember Germany had that snap election when the last coalition government fell apart. So going into this election, we had Merz, heading of the CDU, CSU, Schultz over there with the SPD. Oh, and of course the Greens. And can't forget the AfD, the far-right party. They've been all over the headlines.
Yeah, they have.
Now, the CDU-CSU, with Merz leading the charge, they did win, but it was their second lowest win since 1949. Kind of crazy, right?
It is. You know, at first glance, it might seem like a simple victory for Merz, but looking deeper, well, it tells a different story.
What do you mean?
Well, like a lot of Europe, German politics is moving away from that traditional center, you know?
Yeah.
So while Merz can pull together a government, his power might be, well, more restricted than you'd expect for the leading party.
Oh, that's interesting. And speaking of unexpected stuff, the AfD, they doubled their votes. What's going on there? They seem to have really resonated with voters, especially in the former East Germany.
Yeah, that's the question everyone's asking. From what I'm seeing in these sources, their success seems to be tied to some specific anxieties that people are feeling right now.
Oh, like what?
Immigration, that's a big one, along with the sense that the economy's stuck. And there's this feeling that the traditional political folks, they aren't listening.
You know, going through these articles myself, you do get a sense that a lot of folks are feeling that disconnect from the political system.
Definitely. And it's something we're seeing across other European countries, too. It's something we need to pay attention to.
For sure. Okay, so switching gears a bit, let's talk Merz.
Okay.
He seems like a real character. The sources paint him as a lawyer, someone with experience in the private sector. And get this, he's a pilot, a passionate one, too. What do you think? What kind of leader do you think those details suggest?
Well, I probably wouldn't read too much into the hobbies, but it does suggest a certain level of confidence, maybe even a willingness to take risks, you know?
So not your typical cautious politician.
Not exactly. He's known to be very direct, even confrontational at times. It's a big contrast with Merkel, who was much more about building consensus. This could mean a more assertive Germany, maybe even unpredictable on the world stage.
Oh, that's interesting. And thinking about his personality, how about his stance on the U.S.? What do you make of that?
Good point.
He hasn't exactly held back in his criticism of the Trump administration, called them indifferent to Europe. He's even making a push for more independence from the U.S., particularly on defense. That's a pretty significant shift for German foreign policy, isn't it?
It is. It's important to keep the bigger picture in mind, though, you know?
How so?
Well, this reflects a broader European worry about Trump's foreign policy in general. There's a feeling he's willing to push Europe aside, especially when it comes to Russia.
So is this a crack forming between the U.S. and Europe?
It's possible. And it brings up some serious questions about NATO, the whole U.S.-EU relationship, really. Here's something that caught my eye. Merz wants to keep that ban on working with the AfD in place. But can that hold up, especially with their popularity on the rise?
You think he's trying to play both sides, like pushing for a Europe that's more on its own, but also trying to hold back this surge of nationalism?
It's definitely a complex situation. It's a kind of a firewall, you know, this ban. Keeps the mainstream parties separate from the far right.
Right.
But we've seen these kinds of barriers break down in other countries. It's a very delicate situation.
Yeah, for sure. And Merz isn't waiting around. He's already talking about putting a government together fast. That probably means teaming up with the SPD, even after their big loss. Why the rush, do you think?
Well, I think it shows a sense of urgency, maybe a feeling that there's a lot going on globally that needs to be dealt with, you know? But what's really fascinating is what this CDU, CSU, SPD coalition would actually look like. Like, what would it really mean?
Right.
We got to look past just who's in charge and think about where they might clash, where they might agree.
Yeah.
And with a slim majority, the SPD might actually have a lot of influence.
True, true. One more thing that jumped out at me. Merz is all in on supporting Ukraine. It's pretty different from Trump's stance of, wanting peace with Russia.
Absolutely. And this difference, well, it raises questions about what role Germany will play in any peace talks down the road. How's their relationship with the U.S., which seems to be changing? How will that affect their support of Ukraine? It's like a big geopolitical puzzle, and there aren't easy answers.
It does feel like we're moving into some uncharted territory here.
We are, and to really understand what's going on, we need to look closer at how German politics works.
I'm all for it.
Yeah.
What are some of the things we need to understand about how things run over there?
Well, first off, we need to talk about the Bundestag. It's the German federal parliament. It's where laws are made and the chancellor is chosen. And unlike the U.S. Congress, which has two chambers, the Bundestag is just one.
So one chamber.
Oh, yeah. So that means the party with the most seats, well, they have a lot of power, but it also means they usually need to form coalitions to get things done, to pass laws.
So coalitions are a big deal in German politics.
Absolutely. Essential, really. And putting a coalition together can be, well, a long and complicated process, a lot of negotiating, a lot of compromise.
Gotcha.
And even once it's formed, it's not, always smooth sailing.
Right.
The different parties, well, they often have different goals, different ways of looking at things, and that can lead to, well, tension, arguments.
So just because Merz's party won, it doesn't mean he has all the power.
Exactly. He has to work with those other parties to get things done. And that means he needs to be able to build consensus, make compromises. It's a tricky thing, especially with a personality like his.
True, true. Okay, so thinking about this potential coalition with the SPD, where do you think they might butt heads?
Well, one area where they've historically disagreed is economic policy. The CDU-CSU, they tend to favor a more business-friendly approach, lower taxes, fewer regulations.
Right.
The SPD, on the other hand, they're more focused on social welfare, workers' rights, that kind of thing.
I think I said that makes sense.
So you could see some tension there when it comes to things like taxes, labor laws, social spending.
What about other areas, like foreign policy, for example?
Well, they're both committed to supporting NATO and the Transatlantic Alliance, But there might be some differences in how they prioritize things. The CDU-CSU, they lean a little more hawkish when it comes to defense, while the SPD, they're more inclined towards diplomacy and talking things out.
Okay.
So you might see some debate on how much Germany should spend on defense and how assertive they want to be globally.
So even though they're both center-left parties, they've got some pretty significant differences.
They do. And those differences could make things tough for Merz as he tries to govern. But, it's important to remember that coalition governments they're the norm in Germany, and they've generally been pretty good at working through those differences in the past.
So it's not necessarily a recipe for disaster.
Not at all. It's just something to watch closely as this new government starts to take shape.
Okay, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's go back to the AfD for a minute. You said their success is tied to anxieties about immigration and the economy, feeling stuck. But could you dig into that a little more? What are the specific worries that are driving their support?
Sure. One of the biggest concerns is about how immigration is affecting German culture and identity.
Okay.
Some voters feel like the influx of immigrants, especially from Muslim-majority countries, is a threat to German values and traditions,
Yeah.
And this is something the AfD has been really good at exploiting. They use this rhetoric that often borders on, well, xenophobia and Islamophobia.
That's disturbing. But it's not just about cultural anxieties, right? There's the economic side of it, too.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of voters in the former East Germany, where the AfD is really strong, they feel like they're being left behind economically. They see jobs going away, their wages not growing, their community struggling, and they feel like the government isn't doing enough to help. And the AfD has tapped into this anger. They promise to protect German jobs and, put German citizens first.
So it's a combination of cultural and economic worries, this feeling of being left behind, ignored by the establishment. It's a powerful mix. And it's not just Germany. We're seeing it in other countries, too.
Exactly. And it's something we really need to pay attention to because these anxieties, they're real and they're not going away anytime soon.
All right. So we've talked about Merz's win, the rise of the AfD, how complicated coalition building can be, and the whole geopolitical landscape. But before we go on, I want to get a closer look at Merz himself. Who is this guy and what kind of leader do you think he'll be?
That's a great question. And to really answer that, we need to look beyond the headlines. Dig into his background, his personality, his political philosophy.
Sounds like a job for our experts. Take it away.
Okay, so thinking about everything we've discussed, what should our listeners be watching for as this all plays out?
Well, first, pay close attention to how this new German government comes together. Will that coalition between the CDU, CSU, and the SPD actually work? What kind of compromises will they have to make? Where will they disagree? And don't forget, even though the SPD lost, they might have more say than you'd think.
It's like a game of political chess, right? Every move could change everything.
Exactly. And second, keep your eye on how Merz handles the AfD. Can he really keep that firewall up? Can he keep them isolated? Or will they start to influence mainstream politics? That's a big question, not just for Germany, but for democracy all over Europe, even beyond. It makes you wonder, could we see the same thing happen in other countries? Could a far-right party gain that much power, maybe even in the U.S.? It's a little unsettling to think about.
It is, and it reminds us that democracy is fragile, It needs protecting. We can't just sit back. We need to be involved, hold our leaders accountable, and really stand up for those values of a free and open society.
So what else should we be watching for?
Third, watch how Merz's plan for a more independent Europe actually plays out. Can he get other European leaders on board with his vision? Will it make Europe stronger globally, or will it create more tension, more division? It's a bold move, and it's not clear how it'll all shake out.
It feels like Europe's at a real turning point.
Right.
Like the decisions they make now, well, they'll have consequences for years to come.
No doubt about it. And last but not least, watch how all of this affects the relationship between Europe and the U.S. Will they drift further apart like Merz seems to want? Or can they find ways to work together even as Europe becomes more independent?
It's like we're watching this slow motion renegotiation of this partnership that's been going on for decades, and it's going to have effects everywhere.
Yeah, you got it. The world's becoming more multipolar. The U.S. can't just call all the shots anymore. Adjusting to this new reality is going to take some flexibility, some diplomacy, and a willingness to share power.
It sounds like we're headed into a time of, well, a lot of uncertainty and potential for some big changes.
We are, but uncertainty can also bring opportunity. This is a chance to kind of reset things globally, to build a world that's more just, more sustainable. But it'll take all of us being informed, being involved, being willing to rethink some of our own ideas.
So what's the one big thing you want our listeners to take away from all this? What's the most important thing for them to remember?
Here's the thing. The world is changing, and we get to decide what that change looks like. We focused on Germany today, but what's happening there, well, it reflects these bigger changes happening all over the world. So be informed, get involved, be the change you want to see. Don't just watch from the sidelines. Be a part of shaping the future.
That's a really great way to put it. A good reminder that we all have a part to play in building a better world. Well, that's it for a deep dive into the German election. I hope you've all learned something new today. It's a lot to process, but it's important stuff. We covered the personalities, the policies, the big picture. Hopefully you're leaving with a better sense of what's at stake here, not just for Germany, but for Europe and the world. Keep learning, keep talking about this stuff, and keep being curious about the world. Until next time, keep diving deep.